So this series of Tea with Jules, I've been concentrating on bravery and brave people, and I chose a handful of humans that, in my opinion, are super brave. And I believe that bravery comes in all forms, from starting businesses to raising children to dealing with mental health. There's different levels and layers of bravery. And I have with me today a woman I consider hugely brave. Rabia Siddique is joining me today. International humanitarian.
You got it.
She's an author and a speaker, and in my very humble opinion, incredible. And I'm going to let her share her story, and hold on to your hats because this one is huge. Hello, Rabia.
Hello, Jules. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
I am literally beside myself having you here, only because your story is incredible, and I don't say that lightly.
Thank you.
When I was thinking about this series of Tea with Jules and making it the Brave series, and my good friend Sammy, who is a good friend of yours, she said, you should talk to my friend Rabia. And I looked you up, and I first two sentences in and I was like, wow, this woman is the definition of brave.
Oh, bless you.
So I appreciate you coming. And
my pleasure.
So I'm going to pour the tea and let you start, how you grew up, where you grew up, and the reasons why you're doing what you're doing.
Okay, sure. So I guess like many of people that will be watching and listening, I come from a very mixed background, rich background. My father is an Indian Muslim. My mum is an Anglo-Saxon Aussie, and they met literally in the air. My dad used to fly with Air India, and my mum was a tour guide, a travel agent. So they met on one of Dad's flights and fell in love, and very much against the conservative times that were the late 60s, they eloped and got married. And I was the first of two of their children. We lived in India for the first few years, and then when I was approaching school age, Mum and Dad made the really brave decision to pack up and to come to Australia. So we arrived here in the mid-70s. I was almost 5. And I think that was probably the biggest gift my parents gave me, was the gift of life in this beautiful country. I guess those first few years of living very much as a migrant family, a family of outsiders in Australia in a very different time, were very life-shaping for me. It was when White Australia policy was still very much alive, and I guess what that meant for those of us that came from foreign shores was this expectation and pressure to fit in, and assimilation back then was the buzzword. So the way that you became good Aussies was to blend in and to sort of leave your differences to one side and really fly below the radar. And so I remember thinking from a very early age that I had to lose the accent that I came with and really just blend in and become a good Aussie kid if I was to progress. And I also recall seeing life very much through my parents' eyes. And my dad is an educated, articulate, beautiful man, dark-skinned man, Muslim man, who every day, it seemed in those early years, came up against some form of prejudice. And he would handle it with such grace, but at home you could see that those ignorant words and those harsh words inflicted deep wounds. And Mum as well, Mum wasn't immune, even being a white woman. She was on the receiving end of a lot of bias and prejudice as well, because of the choice she'd made in terms of the man that she loved. And I think what they went through in terms of what they suffered gave me a very early gift, which was a gift of this awareness and this passion that later became my passion for social justice. But I remember thinking more simply as a child, as you do, and thinking how sad it was that people could be so harsh to judge others based on the colour of their skin, their accent, the religion they chose to follow. And so seeing them struggled, I think, was really deeply influential to me in terms of how I later decided to live my life. And I think the other experience that was life-shaping for me came a few years later. So I was an only child up until the age of 8, when finally my baby brother Adam came along. And like many immigrants back then, we had no family. Mum and Dad worked 2 jobs to give us the best start in life they could. And so they were often at work. And as the eldest, my role was to help look after baby Adam. So after school, I would look after him, and sometimes in the holidays, and I loved that responsibility because I adored him. We lived in a very working class neighbourhood in Perth, which is where I grew up, and we lived next door to an elderly couple, and they really took us under their wing, and Ab and I became very fond of them, and we called them Nan and Pop. They became, I guess, our surrogate grandparents. And I was an innocent little girl, and I was a naive little girl, and what I didn't realise until it was too late was that Pop was not a good man. He was a pedophile, and he sexually abused me for many, many months. And like many pedophiles, he was an absolute master at identifying in me what my weakness was and using that against me. And for me, my weakness was this overwhelming love I had for my baby brother. So I suffered in silence for a very, very long time because I knew that if I spoke up about what Pop was doing to me, that it would risk my baby brother going through the same thing. And I knew that because of what he would say at certain times. And he would say to me, you know, if you say anything and if you tell anyone our secret, it might be then time for me to give Adam special time as he called it.
That is so mind-blowingly manipulative and awful.
It is, and sadly all too common because, you know, we know the statistics in our country. 1 in 3 of us has a very similar story to tell as me that has suffered some form of child sexual abuse, usually at the hands of someone you know and trust. So this is still, for all of our progress and affluence in our lucky country, this is something that, you know, affects so many of us, and we need to talk about it. And for such a long time we didn't talk about it, and I guess that's why I openly share this very personal, raw aspect of my journey, because when I was a kid, you didn't talk about child abuse, you didn't talk about mental health, because that was all filled with shame and stigma. And so nothing changed. And really it's only probably been in the last 10 to 15 years where people have bravely stood up and shared their stories that we've been able to change the narrative. And so we now talk about these things in terms of healing and justice. And so that's why I believe we need to share our stories, I guess, which is why I'm here with you today. So I remember one day, many months into this abuse, Mum and Dad were at work. It was the school holidays. Pop came over when he heard them leave for work, as he usually did. And on this day he finished with me. And for the first time, just before he left, he turned back and he looked down at little Adam. So Adam was not quite 2 then, and I was not quite 10. And he looked at him with the same expression that he had looked at me with all those months previously. And I knew in that moment that I couldn't stay silent anymore, because I knew that that was no longer going to protect my little brother. And so I knew I had to speak up. And so I convinced Pop to leave. And I rung my mum and I said the words that no parent should have to hear. And I know she was heartbroken. And I know when she rang Dad that he was mortified as well. But I also know that the decision that they made later on impacted me greatly as well. So my next memory of that day, they were at home and they were talking in hushed voices behind a closed lounge room door, and they eventually came out and ushered me in and told me to sit down, and they held my hand as I was sitting on the couch, and they said to me, you know, darling, what has happened to you is unforgivable, and we will never forgive ourselves, but this will also bring so much shame and stigma on you and on our family name, and we will never be able to progress and thrive as a family, a foreign family in this country. So they decided to do what was very, very common back in those days, which was never speak of the abuse again. So the police weren't called. Pop, from what I understood, was never brought to justice, and I was told never to speak of it again.
And you had to live next door to this man?
For several years before Mum and Dad could save up enough to afford for us to move house.
And did he come back to the house? Did it happen again after that?
No. I know that my father went and spoke to him. I don't know exactly what happened in the background, but I know that he never came to our house again. But I had this really difficult existence because we lived across the road from my primary school, and the direct route to and from primary school was to cross the road and cross the oval and walk past their house and home. So for the next few years, I would take the long way home because I would never want to pass their house.
Of course.
And our kitchen and family room faced his house. So whenever I was at home, the blinds would be drawn, so I would never have to look upon his home or his garden. So that was tough for everybody.
Yeah. Did you ever feel afraid being in your own home, knowing that he was there?
I don't recall feeling afraid. I recall feeling very, very uncomfortable at times. And if I ever accidentally came face to face with him, I remember this visceral response that I would have of almost repulsion.
Yeah.
As I got older and I understood the true severity of what he'd done to me. But then we moved when I was about 14. But by then, what he'd done had started impacting me. So I had already felt like I was quite an outsider because of my differences. And when I went to school, the school I went to was quite a rough and tough primary school. And the only other kids that were different, that were getting a hard time, were the Indigenous kids at school. And they really were getting a hard time. And so I quickly realised that being different was not great, particularly at that time in our history, in our society.
Did you feel that? Did you feel isolated? Did you feel
I felt like an outlier. I really
Yeah.
did feel like a square peg in a round hole. You know, I had sort of friendships of sorts, but I always felt like I was on the fringes, if that makes sense. And, you know, and I had a lot of love, and there was a lot of music in our house and so many friends, and my parents were very sociable people, and we were part of this sort of community of migrant families that were all starting afresh, which was lovely, and there was always plenty of food in the house. But there was an infection that had been implanted at that stage that I couldn't quite identify, that was growing. And that was really at risk of taking hold and consuming me, I think, as I was going into those years when the girl becomes a woman. And that's when I guess my parents gave me the second most important gift, which was changing my environment and changing my school. And they then sent me to this beautiful, beautiful school that, through its leaders, from the principal to the canteen ladies and the grounds people, they were committed to creating this environment where every student and every child's differences were embraced and celebrated. And this place is where I eventually found myself. This place became my haven, and I don't think I'm overstating it by saying this place saved my life.
Wow.
I think psychologically and emotionally, I was heading down a track that may have been irretrievable. So I guess it was going to this incredible school that I finally realised that I was worthy of better treatment than I had received. And perhaps even more importantly, it was during this time that I started feeling more comfortable in myself and believing that I was capable of realising my goals and contributing like everybody else. And by now, what had been deeply rooted in me was this passion to serve others. And so I guess by the time I left school and I had decided that I was going to go to university and study further, I knew two things. I knew that I wanted to dedicate my life to helping others access justice in a way that I hadn't as a little girl. And I wanted to also dedicate my life to helping others find their voice in a way that I had felt very much voiceless as a child. And so I would decide to use the law as a vehicle. So I went off to uni and I did a couple of degrees, and thinking, would I be a psychologist? Would I be an actor? All of those things of which I found and loved at university, I decided no, the law was the vehicle through which I would be able to serve others. So I eventually qualified, and I practiced law here in Australia for a few years, and I was so privileged to work with and alongside people and communities that just educated me and taught me things I didn't know about the world. So I worked with victims of domestic and family violence, with our remote and Indigenous communities, with asylum seekers and refugees. And all the while, as I was involved in this incredible work, there was this voice inside my head that started getting louder and louder. And I finally realised that this was the voice of my calling me to a higher purpose, to even higher work that would eventually see me leave Australia in the late 90s. And what I was being called to do was to serve and to help people that had suffered the most horrific human rights abuses, but people that lived in parts of the world where they just couldn't access justice and equality was a foreign concept. And so in the late 90s I left Australia and I first headed for the UK. I was working in London for a law firm to pay the bills, and I was studying part-time, and I was volunteering with every other spare hour I had at human rights organisations. And time went by and I was getting frustrated because I was nowhere closer to doing the frontline work that had taken me there. And so on a whim, I decided to follow up an offer and an opportunity I had to go on a community aid expedition to South America. So I took 6 months off and I checked out, and I needed to reflect and reset, and that changed everything. So I spent 6 months in South America, and this community aid expedition that I was involved in happened to be supported by the British Army. They were there to provide us with logistic support and security. And this was the first time I'd been exposed to the military. The military was never something on my radar, and I didn't come from a military family, so this was very foreign to me. But what really was surprising was that some of the closest friendships that I made in South America were the army officers that had come to help us. And I now understand why that was, because I resonated with their unwavering commitment to serve and to serve others. And this would then lead to a very unexpected decision in me, which was to apply to commission to the British Army to become a legal officer, and to use that as my next vehicle, to use the military as my next vehicle to access the people that I want to serve.
It was the next level.
I guess you could say that, yeah. I suppose for me everything was a means to an end. How can I get closer to serving the people that so desperately need help? So they say timing is everything, and I applied and miraculously was accepted and selected to commission as a captain in the British Army, not knowing that the week that I would commission would be the week of 9/11. And as we now know, that changed the face of our world.
Yeah.
And it changed the course of my future in so many ways that I couldn't have predicted either. So, you know, after doing my training, and I'll never forget, this is getting heavy, so I'm going to have to lighten this up.
I'm there. I'm going there.
I'll never forget the day that I finally got the call from a senior officer in the Army, and he rang me. I was in London at the time, and he rang to tell me, congratulations, you've been selected. And I thanked him very much. I was gobsmacked. I never thought that they would want anyone, like me. And I remember putting the phone down and then immediately picking up the phone to ring Mum and Dad, who were in Perth, wondering why they weren't answering the phone. And, I'm in my 20s and it's all about me. And I don't think of looking at my watch and thinking, it's 3 a.m. in Perth.
Yes.
That's why they're not answering. So eventually Dad picks up the phone. And he barely gets hello out. And I say, Dad, you'll never guess what? I'm commissioning as a captain in the British Army. And there's this pause, because I actually hadn't shared any of this harebrained scheme with them.
Okay, so this is the first he's heard.
This is literally the first he's hearing
At
about
3
it.
a.m.
Well, why stress them out, right? This may never happen. So
Okay.
I'd deal with that if it was going to become a reality. So there's this very uncomfortable pause, and I'm holding my breath waiting for what Dad's response was going to be, because Dad is the sort of person that... he's kind of one of those people's poets. He's one of those elders that people all flock to for wisdom.
Oh, amazing.
So I was very excited about what Dad's response was going to be to me at this exciting... Exactly, the wisdom at this momentous time in my life. So this silence becomes an uncomfortable pause, and then eventually, poor Dad, half asleep, he clears his throat, and I'll never forget what his beautiful response to me was. He said, Rabia, don't be so bloody stupid. And then he hangs the phone up. And suffice to say that that's not what I was expecting,
No,
right?
he hung the phone up.
He hung the phone up. And, I've already told you I'm, young and it's all about me. So immediately I pick up the phone again, because I think, oh, bless him, he hasn't heard me, he's half asleep.
He accidentally hung up on me.
Absolutely. I realise that actually it's come as a shock to him and Mum, and I need to come home and explain to them why I'm making this barking mad decision.
Yeah.
So I do that.
There was a process.
Yes, absolutely. So I come home, for a lightning trip of 3 days, because I have to then race back and do my military training. And eventually they understand and they give me their blessing, and I go back, do my training, and my first tour is to Northern Ireland. And that is my first experience of, they call it the Troubles. The reality is it's where people commit violence against their loved ones and neighbours and relatives in the name of religion. And this is the first experience of this phenomenon, and I am blown away. I see the badness that we as human beings are capable of. And I see for the first time how we use beautiful things to justify evil behaviour, and it changes me.
Yeah. How do you rectify that? You're now committed to this. Was there ever a moment where you thought, this is too much for me, I don't want to see this, I don't want to know what human behaviour is capable of?
No.
It pushed you forward?
The more I'm confronted with, the more ugliness I see, the more I am shocked, the deeper my belief and faith in the fact that this is my destiny. This is what I'm meant to be doing, and this is where I'm meant to be.
Wow, then you are really meant to do it.
Yeah. You know, I look back now and I think, how could I have not hesitated? But I didn't. It just furthered strengthened my resolve. And I guess also for me, it was never about me. And I know this sounds strange to say this, but ego never played a part. I always saw myself as just an instrument, as a vessel, and that I had been blessed and I had been privileged with a voice and an intellect and a brain and a passion, and so I must use that. I must use that to help others, because there is so much work to be done in this world, and we just have to get on with it.
Did you ever feel the weight of that? Because I feel like that's a heavy cross to bear, so to speak.
Not at this stage. At this stage, what it served to do was to fuel the passion, which just made me stronger and more single-minded. The weight came later.
Yeah.
So the army, miraculously, amazingly, becomes a life that I really embrace, because it is all about service, and because it's allowing me the opportunity to serve with and help all of these incredible people. And the army gives me another unexpected gift, and I meet my then husband, who's a Royal Air Force officer, and we marry. And then a couple of months after we marry, I get another phone call, and I'm told that I have been selected for a very special, important job, and that's to deploy to go to Iraq as the only legal officer supporting the British contingent in Iraq on what we called Operation Telic back then. So this is in the September of 2004, and I'm told that I am to spend the year of 2005 in Iraq as the only British Army legal officer and one of only a few Allied forces legal officers. And it was explained to me that my role was twofold. One of my roles was to provide international and military legal support to the Allied forces and their chain of command. And my second role was to work closely with the Iraqi authorities and help them to rebuild and re-establish law and order in their country after essentially 2 years earlier we had destroyed their country. And I could not believe that I had got this call, because the truth of the matter was there was many officers in my corps, the legal corps, that were much more experienced and senior to me. So I could not understand why I was being selected for this. And I knew that I would be the first female to carry out this role. And I knew that that was significant, and that the military had made quite a significant choice in that regard. And I reflected on this. Why me? Why me? In the weeks after I got the call, as I was preparing to leave for Iraq. And I wondered whether it had something to do with my heritage, the fact I spoke a little Arabic, the fact that I came from a Muslim background, or did it have something to do with the fact that by now I'd been promoted to the rank of major, which was one of the senior officer ranks. So now I was a leader. And I used to use a different language to a lot of other army officers, and I used to lead very much with the foundation of values. So when I would command soldiers and lead, I would talk all the time about how we have to live and lead our purpose and our essence, and our values have to underpin everything that we do. And I used to talk about my 5 pillars, which were my 5 values, and I reflected on those: respect, integrity, courage, compassion, and honesty. And when I reflected, as I was trying to make sense of why I'd been given this job, when I reflected on honesty, I realised that I hadn't completely committed my life to being honest, and that gave me pause for thought. And I realised that I had spent most of my adult life distancing myself from my heritage in order to fit in. And I realised that if I was going to make the most of this gift that I'd now been given, that I had to face and embrace from whence I had come. And I take that and my values with me to Iraq. And I think that that is the only reason that I was able to establish beautiful, respectful, trusting relationships with my Iraqi colleagues, many of whom became my friends. And I believe that's why, fast forward many months into my tour, I then became involved in a situation that would change my life forever after that. And that would become one of the most pivotal events that happened in the Iraq campaign that was reported all over the world, that I didn't realise until much, much later would have profound impact.
What was that?
So it was called the Al Jamiat incident.